The Beto Chair Lecture Series originated in 1981 when the university received an endowment from the Jesse H. Jones and Mary Gibbs Jones Endowment Incorporated, which is also known as the Houston Endowment. The purpose of the gift was specifically to help enrich the educational experiences of the College of Criminal Justice's doctoral students by bringing leading figures in our discipline to campus. It was named in honor of Dr. George J. Beto, former director of the Texas Department of Corrections and distinguished professor of criminal justice at Sam Houston State University, where he served from 1972 until 1992, when he retired. Since its inception, the Distinguished Lecture Series has enjoyed visits by over 80 leading academic researchers and scholars, including such notables as Jerome Skolnick, Larry Sherman, Herman Goldstein, and Dorothy Bracey. Video broadcasts of many of these lectures are available at the college's website, which I encourage you to visit at your leisure. Today, we are proud to add Jack Greene's name to that list. Dr. Greene completed his bachelor's degree in criminal justice at Northeastern University, where he graduated magna cum laude. He then went on to complete his MS in criminal justice and PhD degree in multidisciplinary social science from Michigan State University. He began his teaching career at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee and then moved back to Michigan State University's School of Criminal Justice, where he worked his way through the ranks of assistant to associate professor before moving on to Temple University, where he served as a full professor, director of their Center for Public Policy, as well as serving as director of their Public Service Management Institute for executive level managers. Dr. Greene finally completed the circle by returning to his undergraduate alma mater, Northeastern University. And upon his return to Northeastern, he has served as a full professor, and for 9 years, he was the dean of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. He also served as a special assistant to Northeastern University's provost's office and eventually became their vice provost for experiential learning. Dr. Greene has been actively engaged in funded research projects throughout his entire career, including service as the co-principal investigator of a national survey of criminal justice faculty that was completed under the auspices of the Joint Commission on Criminology and Criminal Justice Education and Standards. In addition to his regular university appointments, Dr. Greene has served as a visiting distinguished professor at the University of Maribor in Slovenia and as a visiting distinguished professor at the Catholic University of Louvain's School of Law in Belgium. He is recognized as one of the country's leading scholars in the field of policing and has published 6 books and a 2-volume encyclopedia of police science, and over 100 research articles, books, chapters, reports, and policy papers on matters related to policing in the United States and internationally. He has just completed co-editing Criminologists on Terrorism, published by Cambridge University Press, with Brian Forst and James Lynch, which came out in 2011. I haven't calculated the specific figures yet, but as I peruse the names of the authors who have contributed to this volume, it appears that at least half of them are either graduates from our PhD program or former Beto Chair lecturers, so I'm certain the quality of the book will be superior. Dr. Greene has consulted for various agencies and organizations, including the Philadelphia and Los Angeles Police Departments, the Justice Department, the National Institute of Justice, the Urban Institute, and the RAND Corporation. He currently serves on the research advisory committees of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Police Foundation, and is a fellow of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. Please join me in welcoming today's distinguished Beto Chair lecturer, Dr. Jack Greene.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is always good to have some attention in the process. First of all, let me thank the selection committee for giving me this great honor to come here and speak with you today. Certainly the College of Criminal Justice here at Sam Houston, the dean, the faculty. It's very nice in your career to have the opportunity to come and speak to colleagues and to their students. So colleagues usually prevent me from speaking to their students, so this is a great opportunity to be part of that process. I'm going to talk today about human rights for policing, or policing for human rights. And I want to start off by suggesting that this is a kind of question that creates strain for lots of people. When I raise the idea of human rights in police meetings, there's a visible tension in the room. And some of that really comes from the field of psychology with kind of the idea of cognitive ease. You know, people would like to have an easy way of understanding things and ways of interpreting them. And if they feel themselves strained in that process, they kind of look for a way to get around that strain. And one of those ways is what's called priming, the idea that you set the idea before you then spring it on people, and it takes a little of that tension away. So this is not a harangue on the police. This is not that the police are doing all the worst things in the world to deal with human rights issues, although there are violations of human rights issues by the police, and I'm not an apologist for the police in that regard. This is really an attempt to try to look at what policing really is, and then to try to make sure that we understand that the complexity of policing actually fundamentally supports a human rights perspective. And I believe, and I think I'm trying to model this in a yet unnamed police department because of the human rights label that I brought the proposal in with, because they're a little concerned about election years and human rights discussions, particularly with some of the things that go on in this particular city. But the point is that we can actually benefit policing institutionally, in my view, by embracing a human rights orientation. I don't care what you call it. I think we have a tremendous proclivity in the policing field to try to name something new every 6 months. You know, so there's a new form of policing that leaps out on the stage, which is usually the prototype of its previous, it's a prodigy of its previous experience. What I really want to do is think about, more importantly, how the police actually function and how a human rights orientation can improve that functioning on several levels. So that's the goal here. I know I have 4.5 hours to speak, so I'm sure you'll all be very glad to see that I'll do that in a little less than 4.5 hours. Let's see if I can do this right. We start out with this, the idea of if not now, when. This comes, you know, it's been attributed to everybody. It's been attributed to Churchill during World War II. It's been attributed to John Kennedy. We had a person in our, the person who led Northeastern's corporate board would always invoke this set of ideas. So I went back and tried to look at it, and actually it's Hillel the Elder in Babylonia many, many years ago, who actually asked 3 questions. If I'm not for myself, who is for me? And when I am for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And it really is a kind of open question about trying to balance self-interest, enlightened self-interest, and to stand for something. And how do I balance that? If I'm not for me, who is? So I have a responsibility to do that. But when I stand for myself, am I just being selfish about that? That's the enlightened self-interest part. And then if not now, when? If I don't take a position somewhere, when do I actually take a position on things? And this has kind of morphed over a long period of time to try to get people to focus on doing something noble, if you will, or being part of the larger social experiment. And the first part of that quote from John Kennedy is there: ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, obviously. That kind of a model invokes the same Hillel ideas in that process. And we see vestiges of that, whether you're a Tea Party supporter or an occupier. You see vestiges of that in both of those movements. So it's not something that is only on the left-hand side of the stripe or only on the right-hand side of the stripe. This idea of people trying to vocalize their self-interest, but also be respectful of the ideas that there are other things that need to be done. I think you see that tension, and we'll see that tension in the 2012 election, no doubt. This lecture is about what the police can do and what they stand for, both empirically and also normatively. So my expectation is to try to take you through that process. Oh, wrong way. Three propositions that I'm going to try to talk about, to try to organize this, that the police are in a transition. American policing is in a very important transition right now, and that transition can either support or reduce our connection to a human rights orientation, and we need to focus on the things that may help us get there and try to minimize the things that I think are restricting us from getting there. Secondly, that human rights can be a central value in policing, primarily because it actually is grounded in what the police do. If you actually go out and look at what police officers do day in and day out, they do a lot more helping than arresting. They do a lot more social intervention than law intervention. And so the reality is that we kind of lose sight of that big kind of pile of information about what the police actually do, and that, as a result, we don't reinforce some of the values that are in this. And the adoption of a human rights perspective, from my view, has practical implications for the police. I know, having worked with and for the police for 30 some odd years, that if it isn't practical, it isn't going to get used. You know, they invite me in to speak as the academic, and then they can write that, I can check that off their bucket list and go on and do whatever they want to do. If it's not going to be a practical application, if it has no practical application, it will not go forward. And so I believe that there are some very important practical implications of this perspective for the police. And it's kind of ironic that Tom Tyler will come and talk about legitimacy, because a lot of those practical implications are in the realm of police legitimacy. So at a time when the police perhaps are struggling for more and more sense of legitimacy, this perspective can help them get part of the way there. And I never sell anything as 100%. If I had the answer to this, you'd be watching my video and I'd be in Fiji with a Mai Tai, okay? It doesn't work that way. But this is a part and parcel of a process that's evolved over a long period of time. I come out of a tradition which starts with race relations in the 40s, police and community relations in the 50s and 60s, the movement towards team policing and the idea of service, complexity in neighborhoods, the movement of that into a community policing framework. Those things are connected intellectually and morally, if you will, over a long span of time, and they try to balance the helping roles of the police with the controlling roles of the police. So which is the shark? This idea, can you see that all from the back? There's kind of a, if you were a surfer and you encountered this, I'd be dead from a heart attack, I think, immediately. Of course, looking at me, you wouldn't see me on a surfboard out there to start off with. But the bottom line is that sometimes we see the shark as the police in violation of human rights, and at other times, the shark might be human rights. The shark might actually be human rights in the ways in which it will affect policing for good or for not for good. We can think of the police implementing programs that support certain values and gaining public support, or we can see that public support being played out in courts of law. So in some ways we're going to get there anyway, and the question is, will we lead it or will we follow it? So keep this imagery in mind if you can as we go on for the next 4 hours. Okay, some background information. I think it's important because I don't think there's a lot of idea that people have about the human rights process. And if you're from any of the countries identified here, I apologize up front, but I'm not less strident in the idea that when we think about human rights and policing internationally, we often think about certain countries and there's very severe violation of human rights. And we could add a long list of those countries, so I'm not here again to pick on a particular country, but we really begin to talk about abuse of authority and power, corruption, torture. You know, the people go missing in certain states, all of a sudden the missing children in Brazil or in Argentina. So all of those kinds of ideas, we have that's a priming idea. So when I talk to the police about this is the first prime that is in their head, and they're saying, we don't do that, and we don't want to be blamed for that, so if you use that language, it's going to make us look like we're already starting at a deficit. On the other hand, we see some problems in U.S. policing with corruption and excessive use of force, and in some places we might think about large human rights violations. It's not a big secret, the city of New Orleans could be the most modern day example of huge civil rights and human rights violations to the point of actually killing people by the police. So it's not that far, it's not only off of our shores, it's in our shores or on our shores as well. On the other hand, while we need to correct those behaviors, those negative behaviors, there's a lot more that the police do in the human rights world that I think needs to be brought into this discussion for a couple of reasons. One is it adequately reflects what they do, and secondly, it is focused on how other people see the police, how the police relate to people. Steve Mostrowski and I wrote an article a long time ago talking about how we talked about rule of law viewpoint actually was a hedge against abuse of authority. You know, if you're in the community and you know the people in the community, it's harder to violate the rights of people that you know than it is to violate the rights of people that you don't know. It's always easier to deal with the other. It's very difficult to deal with people that are close to us and who we know. So in some ways, this model can be used not only to underscore what the police do, but also as a way of starting to reorganize thinking within the police community about what is good policing and what should be done and what is the appropriate thing to do, not only legally, but ethically as well. Okay, long-standing discourse in human rights. For those of you that haven't spent any time with this, I could go much further in this list. We start in some ways at the Magna Carta, you know, the idea that the monarchy is not completely infallible and able to do anything it wants. We talk about the era of the Enlightenment and the works of Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Locke and Paine, all of whom think about the state of man at the time, as it was called, so the state of people for all the women in the room. The state of people, whether that's a good state of nature or whether that's a bad state of nature, and what the relationship of the society is, and when government comes into play, what its restrictions are. And then we see the Declaration, our own Declaration of Independence, but also the French Declaration, and lastly, the United States Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It's a fairly long tradition there of discussion of human rights and the idea of sovereignty and democratic governance and the rule of law in that process. So the UN, interestingly enough, a piece of trivia, so to speak, but Eleanor Roosevelt actually headed the committee that drafted the UN's International Declaration of Human Rights. And she was assisted by members from interesting mix of countries here when you think about it today. Lebanon, USSR, now Russia, China, France, the UK, Australia, Chile, and Canada all participated in the drafting of the Declaration. It has some 30 articles that I'll talk about in groups, not individually. The thing that's very important, it establishes in a very clear language the idea of the rule of law. And the rule of law is very simple in its exposition, maybe more difficult in its application, but the rule of law fundamentally says that when legal decisions are taken, they are taken on the basis of known law. You can't make it up as you go along. There has to be a known law, it has to be announced, and it also has a principle of minimizing discretion in the justice system so law is even-handedly applied. Well, that's the discussion that we're having when we think about legitimacy these days. The idea of the substantive criminal law, it's known, it's announced, but that also there's a constraint on the government to make sure that the government applies that in what now is called procedural justice. So those ideas have been around a long time, and they actually frame the argument about human rights, I think, in a different way. They take it out of this kind of moralistic, it's good to do, it's nice to do kind of thing, to one of saying, don't you want to be in a country where the laws are known in advance, and the application of the laws is going to be as fairly applied, and we're going to pay a lot of attention to that. And again, I don't usually get too much disagreement, especially from the police audiences as well. They say, yeah, that's the way it should be. So they get it, and it seems to me that it is a good starting place. So the human rights, there's three clusters, and I'll do this pretty straightforward. The first, Articles 3 to 21, cover civil and political rights. They look a lot like our Bill of Rights. You know, they are the kind of things that talk about, although we don't have it in our Bill of Rights, I think we would agree that it shouldn't be torture, although the cruel and unusual punishment falls into that kind of a discussion. But torture, the right to counsel, the right to trial, right to free speech, the right to movement in society, all of those kinds of things are in that first 19 or 18 articles. The first just set up the notion. The second cluster, 20 to 27, we don't have this connection with the with the International Declaration of Human Rights. It really deals with economic, social, and cultural rights. The right to a job, the right to leisure, the right to medical coverage, the right to being able to pursue cultural ideas. Remember that a lot of this comes in post-World War II when these are ideas that are being challenged in some very strained regimes. And the last three articles focus on the framework of the application of this. So we are kind of deep on the end of the first cluster, and then it trails off for the U.S., I think, in very important ways. And I want to pick up on that in a moment. So, in the U.S., we've kind of been a little bit different path. We could think about this very intellectually. Robert Frost's, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, I took one. And then we have a very nice poem about the road not taken. Or, if you're a Yogi Berra fan, when you come to the fork in the road, take it. We have been in that kind of a discussion relative to human rights in this country for a long period of time. Is it the road not taken? What side of the fork do we take in this process? And as a result, we have found ourselves in a position where human rights is a path not spoken in the U.S. In fact, you don't hear very much discussion about human rights unless it's somebody else's external to the country. Very rarely do you hear a human rights discussion unless you're reading human rights agencies who are complaining about some of the things that the U.S. actually does do. But nonetheless, we refer to civil rather than human rights, and we have a kind of collection of kind of presumptive rights, implied rights, that come in all kinds of forms. They come in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the amendments to the Constitution, but they also come in agency missions, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Interior. All of those things have certain kind of imbued rights. They're not clearly implied in that process. They're not clear, but they do support the idea that people should have good drinking water, should have an education, should have access to social resources if they're down and out, as it were. And I think the real interesting thing is that we struggle in our political discourse between rights and entitlements. Rights are things you can't take away from people, and entitlements are negotiated. So your entitlement today might not be your entitlement tomorrow, but you can't say we're taking your rights away. So we find ourselves in this struggle a lot, and it has conditioned much of the political and government action in the country, which has made the police step away from that, or government in some ways to step away from that, because the government doesn't want to get too close often to that human rights language and symbolism, because it sees itself as negotiating all kinds of rights along the way. And those rights are typically the ones that are not explicit in the Bill of Rights. And we can see this, in a more fine grain, just as an illustration of voting rights. So, by 1790, only males could vote. The 15th Amendment in 1870 emancipated the slaves, gave them the right to vote. Women were emancipated in 2020. In 1957, the Civil Rights Commission to oversee fair elections. The amendment of the 26th Amendment for 18-year-olds' right to vote. The motor voter laws, which were to better register people in the 1990s, and now 34 states are considering or are now enacted changes to voter ID laws, which will affect the population of voters one way or the other. And we have ongoing struggles, as you all know, in the criminological world about the disenfranchisement of felons, which is a large number of people. And estimates in 2004 were about 5 million, slightly over 5 million. That number has somewhat grown because we still had been in some incarcerative mode in the latter part of the first decade of 2000s. So all these things collectively shape voting. So while we have these rights to vote, we also have kind of government programs that do certain things or to stop doing certain things, states manipulating that process for better or for worse, and the idea that some people continue to be disenfranchised by laws that say if you've committed a felony, you can't vote. Those kinds of things collectively define the voting right in the country. Not any one of them. It's kind of the collective set of ideas, and some of them are not very clearly rights as we understand them. So, you were asking this question of yourself, I'm sure. So why human rights and policing? Why is this important? And I'm going to talk about three things in different ways that I think will help you with that. First is, what do the police stand for in a democratic society? What is the underlying principle of policing a democracy? And how do we articulate that? That kind of articulation sometimes gets lost in the process. And sometimes if we don't reaffirm that, we will find ourselves in pursuit of ideas without knowing the genesis of that pursuit, what makes us go do that. Second of all, there's lots of transitions in policing, and they have very important implications for how the police will either adopt or fail to adopt a human rights orientation. Again, I don't want that language to be the trigger that makes this fail, but an orientation that respects rights and deals with rights in different ways. And lastly, we can raise the bar for human rights in policing because I think there are very important practical and institutional considerations attached to this process. So in policing and democracy, what do police stand for? The rule of law, clearly, creating public value. Mark Moore's set of ideas of public value. It's not just public a set of ideas, but the value that comes out of government. Policing as a collective good. Paul Samuelson created this idea back in the 1950s. Collective goods are non-rival, non-excludable. So you can't be excluded from getting the good if you don't use it, and if you do use it, doesn't mean that somebody else can't have access to that good. That's a collective public good, and public safety is a collective public good. It is part and parcel of the idea that I've never heard a police department say, we're only going to protect the south side this Saturday night, or we're only going to protect the north side this Saturday night, or we're only going to respond to these kinds of problems. We're not going to respond to these other kinds of problems. Now, in practical ways, they actually make decisions to do those things, but they don't do them publicly. Because that would really corrode and corrupt the idea of a collective good in policing. And they uphold the social contract. I was talking to some of your colleagues here, the doctoral students last evening, and there's a tendency to see this social contract from the Hobbesian point of view, and that is the state of nature is mean and vicious and brutish and short, and so government's role is to keep us from killing one another, and because of that, government creates regulation, and it enforces regulation because we're left to our own devices. We're pretty barbaric people. That's one view of the world. Locke doesn't have that view of the world. Rousseau and others don't have that view of the world. Their idea is that in order to get to the public good, an individual has to work in a collective, that the individual can't produce the collective goods. It's difficult for an individual to produce public education, because the result is you need more than one person in that process, or more one set of hands in that process. And because of that, government's job is also to socially facilitate things. So there's a balance between control and social facilitation. It's not just control-oriented. And when we only fall on one end of those extremes or the other, we end up often in political contests about the role of government, maybe as we are today. So, the grist of this discussion is really on kind of the value choices that are affecting policing. And I picked only three. I could pick a lot more. There's some very good police scholars in this room who could probably add more to what I'm going to say. But I picked three of what I think are the most dominant ones that are focused on an anti-human rights perspective, potentially, and those that are focused on a human rights or anchors for human rights. The shrinking public police, the rise of private policing in the regulated society, and police technology and work processes on one hand, which I see as a bit retrograde, moving the police more narrowly, and the pro-human rights for shifting democracies, immigration, the rise of problem-centered government, and social and information technologies. And again, I think we could add more to this discussion, but they only gave me an hour, and so I'm doing the best I can. So let's think about the first detractor, the shifts in public policing. Lots of growth in policing between the 70s and the 2000s. All kinds of data show tremendous growth, 1982 to 2000, 125% increase in policing, public policing we're talking about. And then it slows between 2000 and 2007 to a much lower number, about 2.9%. So we see a tremendous constriction there, and that's about when the housing bubble is about to really burst. And now we see across the country about a 10% reduction in resources for policing. It varies across the country, but we have major cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, among others, Miami, that have experienced reductions, large reductions in resources, not necessarily large reductions in police officers yet, because most of those places have jettisoned civilians. So in Los Angeles, where they lost 600 positions, the city of Los Angeles PD, they got rid of evidence technicians and a lot of inside people. Well, that's not necessarily going to help the police cause down the road, because it seems to me that that's what got Los Angeles in trouble in the first place, was evidence problems. And the result of that process is going to lead to other concerns. In Philadelphia, we actually saw people laid off. In Detroit, we actually saw people laid off. We've seen some cities across the country where we've actually seen blue uniforms go. Much slower filling of positions on the other side of that process. So in some ways, we're going to have a leaner police world over the next few years. And that leaner police world raises implications, because, at least from my perspective, what the police have done who have confronted this is jettison more of their social service activities. So let's get rid of the social service side of the house. If there are fewer of us, we have to take a stronger stand on crime, and the result being that crime is becoming not one of things that police do, but maybe the only thing that they're doing in certain places. And that raises some practical problems for the police. At the same time, crime has declined. We've seen a slight reversal of that over the last couple of years in a few cities. But the public is not, if you look at public polls, crime ain't on it. We're talking about jobs, and then we're talking about jobs, and then we're talking about jobs, right? The economy is front and center, the housing crisis, financial markets, all of those uncertainties that are produced by what we've seen in the world have shifted that discussion, and even the discussion of terrorism doesn't find its way as highly in that process. So when people are particularly financially challenged, those other social issues take a second or third order role. They don't go away entirely, and I'm not suggesting people think that crime has been solved in the country, but it has gone down precipitously, not just in the United States. It's gone down in Western Europe at the same general decline. It's gone down in Canada. So we see the decline in crime rates around the world as an artifact of other things, not just of police work, because there's an interesting book by Frank Zimmering, and one chapter is called The Tale of the Two Tonys. For those of you who don't know what a Tony was a hair coloring that was on the marketplace for women in the 50s and 60s. I don't know how long it existed, but they would always put two very attractive young women on the camera, usually with blonde hair, and they'd say, which one is the Tony, which one is the original, and which one is the Tony? And you couldn't tell the difference, so that made this a good product, right? So Frank uses that metaphor and says, hey, guess what? Crime goes down in the United States, crime goes down in Canada. Canada doesn't do any of the things we did in the United States. It doesn't over-incarcerate people, it doesn't create harsher laws, it doesn't put more cops on the beat, all of those. It hasn't had any major demographic shifts, or large demographics, but crime went down exactly the same rate, or very close to the same rate, as crime went down in the United States, where we've always attributed that loss to police work, or incarceration, or stricter enforcement activities, or what have you. So it's kind of interesting when you get a comparison that directly between a neighboring country, one that shares a very large border. And as a result of all of this, we've also seen most recently a less punitive orientation among the public, partly driven by the economies of things. We don't want to build any more prisons because they're expensive. They're difficult to put on the public agenda, so it's kind of like public education prisons. That used to be able to be done before. When the dollars reduce, then they're actually in competition with one another. And we see major states like California really having to struggle with the overbuilding of prisons and the actually over-warehousing of prisoners, because they're under federal court orders to depopulate their prisons because of overcrowding in that process. Those shifts, for me, are very important because they're kind of affecting the broad nature of policing, kind of structurally, and as we also see socially in a moment. So that's a detractor for me. Another detractor is the rise of private policing. You all read, they make you read Garland here. I expect everybody should have read Garland and Beck and and everybody else that flows from that, Simon now. So the idea that policing is bigger than the police, and that in a regulated society, everybody's got control over people, and that is more diffuse, it's less observable in what the police do, and it's more controlling and complex, and that's certain areas like privatization of public space. That's Margaret Kahn's book, wonderful book on, the overreach of the law, how do we protect, when we Disneyfied New York City and we took Times Square and made it into a Disney resort, that created all kinds of problems relative to public safety on the street. And so the laws started to change where public streets are now under the control of private functionaries. And that changes the nature of individuals' relationships to society. There's been legislation in a number of states to try to criminalize vagrancy. In the real strong sense of criminal. It always has had a criminal connotation to it, but now to actually bring more and more people in for being on the street and convict them for being on the street, particularly if on the street in good commercial areas. That really bothers those people there. And there's been more governance through fear, and that's Simon's work, the idea that governance now, his book is Governance Through Crime, in case you were wondering, I knew that. Governance through fear, though, is the underlying discussion there. We have a very fearful, risk-averse world, and in that fearful, risk-averse world, fear drives a lot of these discussions. And as a result, we end up with policy making that is quite fearful and clearly quite focused on privatizing a whole series of government services because we don't think government can do these things. And I think that's a potential shortcoming. And lastly, detractors from police work themselves. There's a very narrow view of policing. I always remember that Hindu, legend about the blind men encountering the elephant in the field, and each going to a different appendage of the elephant and describing it as they encounter it. So one grabs a tail, a leg, an ear, a trunk. We get a lot of different descriptions of what that elephant might look like. And it's clearly the collective description that really matters. And I think that's a struggle that we have with police work, technologies, and some of our own research. I'm sure I can frustrate a lot of people, so I might as well do it with some of my colleagues as well. We have statistics that are manipulated by the police regularly. We've seen that in some major scandals in major cities. The ComStat area is the greatest illustration of that. So we get a book written about ComStat as the best thing since sliced bread, and now that same author is rewriting that because we found that a lot of precinct commanders were going south with their crime. They didn't want to stand in front of Bratton any more than any of the rest of us want to stand in front of Bratton, and as a result, crime gets suppressed. And there's always been political pressures, particularly in big cities, to suppress crime. To change its definitions, to report it later, to lag it, to do all kinds of things that keep the average crime rate down. So we have to be just worried about that a little bit. We also have lost our zeal for scientific longitudinal studies of the police themselves. If you haven't read this literature, it's a wonderful literature. Go back and start reading William Wesley's Violence in the Police in Gary, Indiana. He actually is in this police department for a year, and he finds some really bad stuff. But he finds the culture and the context. He surveys people. He interviews people. He goes on ride-alongs. It's a much more qualitative study. And it has shaped how we think about police culture, by the way, very profoundly, even today. Even though most of the studies today are mostly about surveying people about culture, which is, I can imagine Margaret Mead showing up in the Samoan Islands with a survey. It's kind of hard to do sometimes. So I think that the problem here is that there are lots of studies in that era between the 50s and the 70s that tried to flesh out what policing meant. And they are still standing. If you go back and look at somebody's journal article, it always cites all of these, except that I think it's changed. I've been out on the streets with police. It's changed dramatically. And the result is we don't have really good qualitative assessments. I know Mostrovsky and company did some work on the kind of an extension of the work that was done down in Charlotte a number of years ago. But there just aren't a lot of studies about what the police are now doing. and what that means now. We have huge cultural shifts over the last 30 years, but we haven't really focused on the differences in what that has meant for the police. The people coming to policing are different. They're less military trained, they have less of that kind of an orientation when they come in. So what does that mean for the culture of policing? We have more technology driving policing. What does that mean for the culture of policing? And I see that in pieces of the literature, but it would be nice to have a group of people worldwide that focused on those qualitative dimensions a little bit more, because they do shift and they make a lot of difference in explaining what the police do. And as a result, crime mining of crime data has become a cottage industry. Everybody can get a large hay pile of data and then crunch it for 2 or 3 weeks of course, the systems work faster now. But nonetheless, that's only a small view of the police. It still needs to be done. I'm not suggesting that it's inappropriate, but it has become a kind of the gold standard, if you will. If you've read Rob Sampson's article about quantitative evidence-based criminology and the gold standard, you come away from that article with a little bit different view of what that should be. And so the result is, while we have these models out there, we end up with a very narrow measurement about what the police do, a very narrow measurement. And while we like to describe university professors largely on the basis of the books published and articles published and grand opportunities to speak at fora like this, we actually grade papers and talk to students and all that mundane stuff that actually makes the university such more substantive. So we don't want to just count those research articles. Those are important, but they're not the sum of what people do. People do a lot of other things. And I think we've kind of narrowed our discussion in policing only to crime and only to even small spaces in crime, which is, I think, another set of problems. So what are the implications? I've said some of them. It narrows the definition of police work. It narrows the role of policing in formal social control. We don't look at those linkages very much any longer. Shifts in public police to the margins of the discourse, stopping crime. And stopping crime in a 12-block area. Typically, but just putting more cops in there, which is, I think, kind of interesting, because that's O.W. Wilson's set of ideas of police omnipresence, which was written in 1950. So in some ways, we haven't come very far. We just put more cops there. Not what they do is measured very well, and what it means by what they do to themselves and to the residents of those particular areas. So we have to just be careful about that. We also have some ideas that we are shifting that discussion away from public service policing, and in some ways away from constitutionality and policing. If we privatize, if we only measure the small numbers of things that police do on a legal forum, we run the risk of having a very negative, tight view. And the old adage, if all we have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, starts to become the way in which we frame the discussion around policing. Okay. Immigration and demographic shifts are monumental, and I know across the country, this part of the country particularly, there's lots of discussion about immigration, and some of it very terse discussion, and okay, I get that, and I'm not going to have that debate right now. But what we do know from major studies of immigration is that immigration changed countries. Very rarely is immigration just absorbed. It has a change. It changes culture, it changes expectations, it changes language in some areas. And if you read George Freeman's work, The Next 100 Years, he's talking about birth declines in the US and in Western Europe to the point where both of those two continents, if you will, are going to be focused on how do we get more immigrants to come here, because we're not going to have enough native-born people to do the work. So immigration is going to shape this discussion as we're going forward, and as it does with peoples from different parts of the world, the human rights aspects are going to become, I think, more salient in that discussion. And the melting pot ideas, I think, are, Daniel Patrick Moynihan notwithstanding, an artifact of a different age. Most research on immigration now suggests that immigrants also maintain their cultural identities, and those cultural identities shape the social circumstances of where they live. So we have to see that as a way of policing having to adjust to that. Also, the rise of problem-oriented government. We had a functional kind of industrial governments through the early 19th century into the 20th century. We had police, we had schools, we have healthcare. Now we have safety issues, and the police are part of that mix, but so are the healthcare officials, so are the public schools. So we begin to see, under new ideas of public management and tightening finances, that to get value out of government, we have to think more expansively about government services. It's no longer just the police that produce safety. They are one of many voices in that process, and they share leadership for that. The genie, as it were, is out of the bottle, and the police have produced, some places, some very good partnerships. In a lot of places, it has been lip service. It has been a kind of, okay, we have to do this. And the result is the genie's out of the bottle. Police agents, it isn't going back in. Police agents are going to be confronted more and more with dwindling municipal resources, are going to have to partner functionally with other agencies of government to get their job done. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that will actually help the police tremendously. And lastly, this idea of social information, civic accountability. I was at a meeting a few months ago, and a police chief who will go unnamed said to me, you know, it was really interesting that the Rodney King incident was produced by one person and a video camera, and now we have millions of phone cameras out there. You know, so the police are being observed more, and not by social scientists, by people in the community, by activists. Boston most recently lost a case against a person who was filming the Boston police, and the court said in Massachusetts, there's nothing wrong with that. You can't prohibit them from filming something in public view out in a neighborhood or out in a governmental setting or out in a public setting. So we're moving in that direction, and we've seen this in other places of the world. The Arab Spring is a networked set of ideas. I mean, it was very clear that social media played a role in that process. The magnitude of that is always under question, but the fact that the social media was part of that is not a question in my view. So technology is actually affecting governments, I think, in important ways, and the public police are not always very well equipped to deal with this. This is still a struggle. We saw the struggle of them adopting computers. We saw the struggle of them adopting to data analysis. And now we see the struggle about how other media are going to be used to actually create policing improvements. But it's going to happen. This is from an IACP study. It's kind of, if you have really good eyes, you can see this. But the first 4 columns are the use of social media. This is in a report of about 200 and some odd agencies, just recent report from IACP. The first 4 columns were traditional police activities, you know, criminal investigation, monitoring the environment, intelligence, and scheduling, soliciting tips on crime, the first 4 columns there. And so in the criminal investigation side, it goes up very well. You know, the cops are looking at Facebook, you know, because that gives them information about investigating. Who was the person last in contact with? Who are their friends? All of that kind of business. So I think that's interesting. The second 4 columns are really about things that are on the front leading edge, or could be on the leading edge. And the thing that's interesting is that a large number of these come in the 40 percentiles. You know, so most of half of agencies responding. And those are things like notifying the public of crime problems, notifying the public of emergency situations, crime prevention activities, and community notification and community communications. So we begin to see more of that on the ledge, and that ledge creates more openness for the police, at least the potential for more openness. And toward the end, we face things that really still need to grow a bit. They are using social media for training and for recruitment activities and for doing background investigations and those kinds of things. So social media is slowly, although in some cases 71%, not slowly, being inculcated into the police. So I see these things collectively as leading to a new way of thinking about institutional legitimacy and a new police order, which you'll hear much more from Tom Tyler, no doubt. But the legitimacy of the police comes under question when we only focus on those crime things. The police need a hedge to dealing with crime on the one hand, but dealing with social facilitation on the other, and a set of values that allows us to understand that the authority given to the police can be maintained by police action, not just destroyed by police action, but actually maintained by it. And the history of policing, the scandal and reform was I think it was Larry Sherman's dissertation, as I recall, many years ago. The idea that there's this cycle of scandal and reform. We see scandals, we see reforms. 20 years later, we see a new set of scandals. But the police are particularly concerned with and being challenged by immigrant communities. They're the least integrated, if you will, into the social fabric. They trust the police the least. They have lots of problems of both crime and victimization, but also of all kinds of other things that maybe we could pay as much attention to. And so it is very likely that the police are going to have to spend a lot more time getting public support in those communities than they have in the past to get legitimacy. And legitimacy issues, I was speaking last night, are not very new. I mean, I won't read all of these, but they start with the draft riots of the Civil War, and they end with, kind of widespread techniques used in places like New York City of just stopping and questioning people. Last year, New York City stopped 750,000 people. That's bigger than the whole city of Boston for kind of just being there. And the being there was largely being in a bad neighborhood, or being in a poor neighborhood, or being in a black and brown neighborhood, or being in a Muslim neighborhood, or being in an other neighborhood. And so there's some really interesting work. Fagan is doing some very interesting work of that in New York City. But the bottom line is bolded for a reason. What we have found, and this is really true since 1968 finding of the National Commission on Civil Disturbance, that most riots occur because of a police action. In some ways, you could say that the American police, and I think the police in Britain and other places, are one bad decision away from a riot, or one bad action away from a riot. And if it's that thin, if the margin is that thin, it says we're not paying attention to the other side of the house. That is, how do we build consent? How do we build relationships in that process? And if you were at UC Davis here, having your head sprayed with, if you saw that YouTube video, it's pretty frightening. That people would just stand there and spray people who were just seated on the ground for 10, 15 minutes. And I've also seen the alternative discussion of that, which I frankly think has a lot of, in proper term, manure attached to it. The result is what you see. You see actually people being pepper sprayed in a fairly aggressive way for, in some ways, blocking a sidewalk. That kind of social disturbance creates all kinds of problems. The Occupy folks, people think this is new. It's not new. We had Hoovervilles in the 20s and 30s actually earlier than that, around tax policies and the failing economy at the time. And the World War I veterans coming back created what they actually called the bonus army camps, because they were supposed to get a bonus for coming back from World War I that they didn't get. So they said, well, let's all camp out on the White House front lawn, So we have these things in our history that we just probably don't want to ignore, because the police are going to be at the front edge of that. So how do we raise the bar for the police? And I'll try to do this quickly. We raise the bar by doing a whole bunch of things, but the thing that I'm most concerned about is raising the bar by actually looking at what the police do, rather than to kind of hypothesize about it or moralize about it or create some way of overestimating that. I'm sure that this will go up on your website too, so you can have copies of it if you like. But you have to clearly understand the rule of law and recognize what the police actually do. The practicalities of policing and human rights is that human rights only happens through police action. The police can either affirm or deny human rights. They can either go to a house and affirm or deny a victim. They can go to a particular location and affirm or deny the circumstances there. So it is in the discretion of the police to affirm or deny the civil and human rights of individuals, and it has very practical implications. I'm not going to beat this up too much. This is the old medical model. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions, first order, second order, and third level interventions. And in the policing world, prevention, response, and mitigation or rehabilitation are those responses. And from a human rights perspective, this is in a paper that I did for the Police Foundation, it really has this idea of securing rights, upholding rights, and reaffirming rights to look at what the police do. This is what I'm trying to model in a yet undisclosed police department. In the primary intervention world, we have police doing all of these things. They do secure assembly, free speech, religious practice. The police do, in fact, are advocates for unprotected populations. They deal with victims. They deal with the endangered. They deal with the mentally ill. They deal with homeless people. So it's not like they're not there. I think that's one of the first recognitions, is that they are there. What they do is a different matter right at the moment, but they're on the front edge of that, not on the tail edge of that. They enforce court orders. They're involved in various community policing schemes or fear reduction schemes or civic engagements. They assure free movement. These things are part of what the police do. And we actually count a lot of these things, but typically not in the crime statistics, more in calls for service or in other information systems that the police have, car logs report. And it's messy business to get into all that. I understand that. And then we think about this is the deep end of the pool. It's in the middle of the pool. We have a pool that has two shallow ends and one deep end from our own understanding. So when we think about upholding rights, that's largely associated with making sure that constitutional rights are provided to people once they're the subject of the law. And you know all of that stuff. And it's in the first cluster of the human rights conventions. You know, right to trial, right to see your accuser, right to attorney, all of those kinds of things. Okay? So we're there. We spend a lot of time on there because they're very critical incidents. And I'm not saying we go away from that. But I also want to look at both of the other ends of the process, because the other ends of the process, I think, help build legitimacy for the police. And the tertiary rights are really about kind of restabilizing communities. And we see some of this in offender reintegration programs and victim and community restoration programs. The restorative justice movement has a police component to it. It's not always exercised by the police, but it has a police component to it. And also, you know, police departments are doing offender and victim recontact programs all the time. There is out-group protection in many places. And so we really begin to see that there are roles to play in this tertiary rebuilding, reaffirming rights area that the police can be involved in. The discretion of the police, I think, fits into this very importantly. And again, the thing that's most amazing to me is between 50 and 80% of police work doesn't fall in that middle. On Friday night it might, 100% might, I don't know. But, you know, not on Sunday morning. And not on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, now Thursday it starts to creep back up again if you look at the weekly plots. And so the result is order maintenance and those kinds of activities are much less law invoking. That's why we call them order maintenance. Yes, the police use their legal authority to involve themselves into that, but they're often dealing with referrals to mediate disputes, aid victims, protect victims, battered children. They do civil court orders and all kinds of things associated with that. They regulate traffic. They make sure that they're part of the national reentry programs in every state. So we don't count any of that. The thing that's so amazing to me is this richness of activity that we don't see as part of the fabric of policing. We're still drilling down only on that crime fabric or that crime dimension of the process. So there are research implications to broaden the discussion of policing in democratic society. Peter Manning's book on democratic policing, which is always fun to go through because it's complex, as is Peter. And we've unfortunately just recently lost Jean-Paul Brodeur, who wrote a very good book called The Web of Policing, which looks at high and low policing and the nature of the police complex. But most of those arguments are about how do we make sure that policing is democratic and shift from these narrow definitions to a more contextual idea of what the police say. A number of years ago, I participated in a research program called Measuring What Matters. It was a federal government program. And it almost always got back to crime. I want to call the new program Measuring All That Matters. You know, I'm not going to throw crime out because it's there and it's important. But it isn't all that the police do, and in some ways, by only focusing on the crime dimension to that, we lose that contextuality. And we have this evidence-based obsession at the moment. And I know there's some very good research out there, and I know the researchers, I know the usual suspects in the field. But I also worry that sometimes we're more worried about showing displacement or diffusion of benefits than we are figuring out what the hell the police did in the neighborhoods in which they were located. And I need to know the connection between the treatment, the dosage, and the outcome. And so if you black box the treatment and the dosage, I'm not sure what happened there. But something happened there. There were a lot of cops who went into a small area, and crime left, mostly for a long time in most kinds of crime. But that's kind of a general radiation treatment. You know, it doesn't get to me the idea of a chemotherapeutic where we're trying to isolate the kinds of problems and the kinds of responses that best affect them. Maybe this is the first step in that direction, fair enough. But I do worry that we find out in much of this evidence-based process that we have black box what produced the evidence. We have the evidence now defined in geographically matched areas and the rigors of some quasi-experimental design, but we don't actually know what the cops did there. And that raises some real concern for me. The policy implications are straightforward. They match a lot of the COP things in the top list there: increased partnership, problem solving, accountability, blah, 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 blah. But the last two are the two that I think are most important. They involve reinforcing a value set and practices among the police. It broadens the base of support for what the police actually do. And that's among the police themselves. It's very interesting to see the police reject some of their order maintenance responsibilities because they want to go fight crime. If they're not dealing with order maintenance problems, they're probably not going to end up, well, we'll be fighting a lot more crime, generally speaking, because some of those order maintenance problems are going to turn into criminal events, and they happen in the same places. So it's not as if they're unconnected. And also, I think that it does no damage to this idea of police enforcing the law. I don't want to strip the police of that responsibility. Nobody else is going to do it. I absolutely understand that. But the police do a lot more than that. And at that lot more, I think, is a critical component for modern policing. There are some cautions. In the police world, we still have some major issues of occupational distance, this disjuncture in police cultures, even within the same agencies. Still a security risk and militarization going on in police agencies, which I think raises a lot of questions. The working environments of police departments have become narrow as we've concentrated crime in these little areas. We never send cops into good places. You know, wouldn't it be nice if they went in and actually met some people that weren't warring with one another so that everybody didn't look like a combatant in the neighborhoods in which they find themselves? So there's a narrowing there. And again, I think we have really failed to understand good policing. We focus on police failures, but not on what good policing is. And it's difficult to measure, I get that. But if we don't measure that, how are we going to contrast it with what bad policing is? What's the alternative? The external responses are pretty straight. We've shifted from crime to terrorism. It has its own set of problems. Again, militarization. There's a backlash to community policing. If you read the work of Steve Herbert or Bill Lyons, you know, and this is in Seattle, a very progressive city, where the cops hated community policing. They hated the idea of community policing. They belittled it. They chased at least one or two chiefs out because of that, okay? So if that's going to be the underlying model, we have to think about that external set of problems, both, well, that's more of an internal set, but it's also the external environment didn't support the police in those cities, which I think is really, it's two very good books if you haven't read them. There are some major demoralization efforts of immigrants. Immigrants are the other now. They are, you know, they are the equivalent of the mods and rockers, if you know Stanley Cohen's work on the idea of the social construction of crime and the social construction of crime waves and deviance and fear that comes along with that. And lastly, we have new crimes and new social problems that the police have to deal with in a more direct way. Conclusion. And I think these are the important takeaway points. First of all, it's very much, in my view, a very false tension an unnecessary premise that somehow policing and human rights have to be antagonistic towards one another. They do not have to be antagonistic towards one another. And as long as we start with that premise, we've set, remember I talked about that framing discussion on the front end, we set it, and then it's hard for people to get beyond that. Secondly, the police are intimately involved in activities that support or have the potential to support human rights. So it's not something that they're not doing. I was talking to an unnamed colleague and friend who said, you know, if you don't make this so that the police think this has practical implications, nobody's going to buy this. Because we've had all these labels slapped on all these things. But this comes right out of police workload studies. This is not new. This is what you're doing day in and day out. We need to acknowledge those activities, award them, and move them more centrally to the core of what policing means in particular locales. And I believe this increases police institutional legitimacy as well as the police ability to deal with social problems. And on the legitimacy side, it does it from two levels, in my view. First of all, it shows the police in a public setting with the public, helping to inform social order locally defined that's not criminal. And I think that's a way of, again, showing that there's more to policing than coming in and kicking your front door in or arresting your son or daughter off the street. Secondly, the police, if they see that themselves, as I said, it's harder to violate the rights of people you know. It's harder to violate the people's circumstances if you think that this is not what we do. And I think there's a real struggle within the police culture about what is the ascendant goal here. So I think if we can resolve some of those, we will actually increase the legitimacy of the police as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate you all being here.
I wanted to ask you about the measurement. You talked about some of the measurements of crime rates not really capturing everything that they needed to do. Mm-hmm. And you talked about some of the qualitative things that could be done. How do you really measure the community state of crime, state of safety?
Well, the first, thank you for your question. It's a good question. I think you measure this community state of crime, if that's what you're talking about, which is, again, a very narrow definition, by looking at police calls for service for crime events, arrests made in those neighborhoods, on-view arrests made, meaning that there are more police often there because they see that as a high crime area. Maybe look at the deployment patterns of police agencies to get a better understanding of that. But again, that's a very small piece of the pie. We have fear studies of various communities. We have studies of support for the police. You'll hear from those with Dr. Tyler when he comes. So we have ways of measuring the other side of that crime dimension, and that is in the application of the law, both substantively and procedurally. So I think there's a lot there, and I think we have some handle on some of that. But you know, the calls for service data are voluminous. And some of them are not very good. I actually do understand that the calls for service data are difficult to deal with. And sometimes it's like trying to get a drink of water from a fire hose. You know, there's so much information coming out of them. But, you know, that is what the police are doing. Somebody called, what Bittner said, you know, something is going on here that ought not to be happening, about which somebody ought to do something now. And that's the police role, according to Egan Bittner. And because of that, we actually have to understand those things. Because I don't believe that the disturbing neighborhood is one that doesn't have also a crime problem. These things are highly correlated. So if you're only looking at, in the Comstat model, you know, the 7 deadly sins, you know, murder, rape, robbery, you know, aggravated assault, auto theft, and arson, if you're only looking at those things, you're not looking at other argumentation that goes on in the street. You're not looking at bar fights that don't result in, you're not looking at hospital emergency room entrances that may be about overdose or about somebody who did get punched in the nose. Those things go by the board. They're not in the discussion. So, you know, again, we have this kind of narrow view of what the police do if we only look at that crime side of the fence. I'm not saying that we throw that out. So I'm trying to be very careful not to do that because it's extremely important. On the other hand, the other things that police do are extremely important too. And I hate to kind of lose the richness of that in the pursuit of only one dimension of policing. And that richness comes from difficult data sets to put together, and you have to convince agencies to do certain things, but car sheets, the ways in which self-reported activity comes into the police agency, what comes through the 911 system and the reporting process there, what special units do that don't find its way into that process. There's a lot more there about what police activity is. And I'm concerned that we're kind of looking at a very narrow range of that and defining the elephant by holding on to the trunk. And, you know, so an elephant is a very low, long thing, right? Well, it isn't. So we ought to be able to try to look at some other ways to describe the police. But from the crime perspective, we have a number of ways to measure that. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Jack. That was a really nice presentation. I mean, you touched on a ton of good nuggets of information in there, but I want to ask you about the measurement part. We spent a couple of my classes recently with some of the students here in the audience talking about measurement. I mean, if you could just talk about that a little bit and how we get at possibly classifying, certain police activities on a continuum of how they might support or undermine the protection of human rights.
Sure. Let's start with an article written by Udall, and last name escapes me in a moment, it'll come to me, in 1965. Many of you weren't born in 1965, I understand that. In 1965, a very interesting article written in Social Problems called "The Policeman as Philosopher, Guide, and Friend." And it was one of the first studies that looked at calls for service to police agencies over time, day of week, time of day, and all that, but then categorized them, the kinds of troubles that people were reporting, many of which were not police problems. And they ended up with this idea that the police officer is this philosopher, guide, and friend, not just the punisher. So we have a long history of looking at police calls for service. I looked at that with Carl Clockers in Wilmington, Delaware in the 1990s, and we challenged the idea that policing was so smallly related to crime. We said there's a much larger volume. I suspect it might be larger now. I don't know. There are measurements, and those measurements come from about 4 sources, I think. The first source is calls for service data, and that requires a lot of time and effort. Those are not easy to deal with. In the agency that I'm working with, we're trying to create what I'm calling the Police Practices Internal Group. And they're going to help me noodle through this, not as a social scientist, although I probably don't deserve that entire label, but not as a social scientist, but rather as, what does this information mean to you? Because it doesn't show up in the ComStat meetings. It doesn't show up in the discussions that are about, what are you going to do about the burglary problem here? What are you going to do about this disorderly bar? It doesn't show up in those meetings. So we're going to try to connect those things out of the calls for service. Secondly, the car sheet data is produced. We might have to sample it. And I know it's vague, and I know some of it's done 5 minutes before the shift ends. I know all the validity and reliability questions that are part of that. But maybe over time you improve that data set in the process. You can also look at other agencies' data. The health department keeps violence measures separate from the police department. That includes hospital room admissions, but also, responses of EMT and others where the police don't go. So there are data sets there. It's going to take some noodling. I'm not suggesting that it's a simple thing, but I believe that 1, the data are there in a richer sense, and 2, they will describe a broader sense of what the police actually do. Now, I think then you have to start categorizing that once you have that kind of flow of information. But I think it's going to come into ideas of, helping people who are distressed, dealing with other forms of social harm, dealing with crime and violence, no question about that. Some of it's going to be dealing with lost stuff, cats, dogs, children, right? All of those kinds of things that happen on a regular basis. Those, to me, are a kind of affirming activities of the police, that the police can find themselves in a position to say, I've never seen a police department report, we found 27 children this year that were lost, or, and that may sound like a kind of odd statistic, but you know what? If you don't start in that discussion, you're only going to be, we solved the 2 murders, or we had 2 murders this year and we have 1 last year, so we have a 100% increase in murder. That kind of thing chokes off the police, I think, in very powerful ways. Then I think you have to be broad about this, and this is where the struggle with my client agency is at the moment. And they're very nice people, and I enjoy them, and hopefully we'll noodle it out. And that is, I want to do focus groups out in the community. Ooh, human rights in the community, talking to people about human rights. This is an election year. That's what I heard. So I get the sensitivity to that. So maybe we take human rights off of it, and we just do some, have you used police services, what do you think about them, and try to localize them and maybe model this in one particular place. But I think there's a lot more there. And again, if you only use the number of surgeries done as the measure of the medical profession, you would lose all those hospital avoidances, right? I went to the general practitioner, and the general practitioner told me I didn't need surgery, or gave me something else. So I think, if you're going to define medicine as only morbidity, and some people do describe medicine only as morbidity, you end up describing a very small aspect of the medical profession. So I would like to try to broaden that discussion. I hope that answers your question. So, yeah? Okay, thanks. Yes?
Hi. First off, I really enjoyed your talk. I think human rights and policing is something that's not talked about enough, and I think it's very important. But I have two questions that you've been kind of touching on the whole time, and I'd just like some clarity, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first question is, I know that in some of the human rights literature, defining what human rights is very difficult. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering first what your take on that was. Mm-hmm. And then second, do you have any best practices or suggestions for getting police officers to, one, recognize the importance of human rights issues, and two, to recognize human rights problems or best practices for addressing human rights problems in everyday practice?
Okay, for the next 2 hours I'll talk about this. I don't think human rights is that difficult to define. I think that we have many evolutions of the human rights models that are out there, and the UN is still a very strong one. I think there's an irony in the US, by the way, and that is that while we were seen as an important model for the creation of the international human rights instruments of the United Nations, we are no longer seen as such. South Africa, Canada, Justice Ginsburg was asked this question, this very question, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she said, yes, we want to be building more democratic processes and constitutional and human rights-oriented processes, and she was speaking about the Middle East at the time, and she says, but the U.S. isn't the model. The model is South Africa. Now this is a Supreme Court justice. So we have shifted and we have lost a little of that, and in fact there's a big study out of NYU just last year that looked at all these various constitutional adjustments, and it's fascinating. The general model is that constitutions should probably be adjusted, tinkered with, about every 19 years. It's kind of interesting. It's about every generation or so, right? And in fact, Jefferson said the very same thing when the Constitution of the U.S. was created. But we keep this thing, and now we have kind of discussions that we have to go back to the original founders' intent. Other countries say, we are the original founders, It's our generation's set of problems with this constitutional set of issues. How are we going to address them? So I think there are very clear models of human rights, including the EU's models of human rights, and many of the signatory countries that have been part of that. In the Netherlands and in Ireland, and Northern Ireland experience is a very strong one about human rights. We actually see police agencies getting training on the human rights issues and killing less people, which is always a good start. So they have some models out there. Best practices is a tricky set of ideas. I worry about police agencies always trying to put themselves out as being the best practice because it makes them look good and the chief doesn't get fired and all that kind of business. But the bottom line is we do have some really strong illustrations in Europe, and particularly in Netherlands and in Netherlands. I want to retract the Netherlands, particularly in Ireland and Northern Ireland in that response. We can see some of that in Canada as well. Canadian policing has done a lot differently, and they've gone through some of the same problems that we've gone through. They had big commission reports of police spying, and McDonald Commission, and a whole bunch of things were really about the overreach of police intelligence functions by the RCMP. So they're out there. What blocks this is a kind of sense that, and this always treads, I will tread on all of you with this, don't tread on me over there, and that is the idea, this American exceptionalism idea, that somehow we can't learn from the rest of the world. Well, that's a pretty narrow way of thinking about things. I think there are lots of things we can learn from the rest of the world. I think there are lots of things the rest of the world can learn from us. It shouldn't be an asymmetrical communication, and it is at the moment. The work that's done by John Braithwaite, particularly down in Australia, introducing a more human rights and restorative process to justice system. We can learn a lot from restorative justice practice in this regard. So I think the elements are there. You just kind of have to have a little bit to really act when I say human rights. Okay. What are you talking about? Because that kind of priming effect is there. Human rights is what you do to violate, we're going to complain about you violating our human rights. And it seems to me that even in the EU, with all the human rights activity, if you go on a EU website, you'll find hundreds of documents about human rights. Every imaginable group's set of human rights in the EU. Are they all completely supported? No. But is there a political agenda there to try to structure that better? I think so. So I think that's where we are in the process. But I don't think we have to look too far, honestly. I think if we even just start at the UN model, we've gone a lot of distance already. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, it's a perfect time to stop. There's about 10 minutes before the follow-up session will take place in the Bates Room. Thank you all for your attendance, and thank you again, Jack, for the...
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Oh, good. Really good.